Well, thank you, Amy. It's great to be back at Pinecrest Historical Village, although I'm not a total stranger to the grounds and buildings here. I do come back every so often, although I haven't worked here for 19 years. But actually, I've been gone longer than I actually worked here. I worked here 14 years from 1987 until 2001. And before coming here, I am an archaeologist by trade, so I was working for the St. Paul District Corps of Engineers up in St. Paul and commuting from Madison. Our kids, Aaron and Megan, were just two little girls, age, I think, 3 and 1.5. And it just so happened that this job came open here at Manitowoc County Historical Society. And my wife's family is actually from Manitowoc County, Manitowoc and Two Rivers. So it seemed to be a good fit for me for that time, and I applied and got the job and enjoyed every minute I worked here. And but I got up this morning and had a cup of coffee, and I was looking at the comics, and then I turned over to the horoscopes, and I read my Taurus horoscope, and it says as following: set up a conference call, join an online group that interests you, and engage in activities through social media. It's time to change the way you do things. I almost fell off the couch reading it because that's exactly what we're doing today here in Manitowoc. We're coming to you live from the restored McAllister farmhouse, which sits on the grounds here at Pinecrest Village. And it's one of the buildings I helped move many years ago. And it's been restored now as the Welcome Center, Research Center, and gift shop. And it's great to be here and to be part of that long storied history and heritage of the county. So let's get started. Plans for Pinecrest Village didn't just begin in 1970. This was a program and a project that was many years in the planning. Our earliest records here indicate that the earliest evidence that we could find of a pioneer village was dating back to 1964, when Joe Rappel suggested to the Manitowoc County Board of Supervisors that a pioneer village be built here in the county. And the committee was appointed to find a suitable rural school, which could become the first building of a contemplated village. The following year, a committee was formed to begin work on building the village. And some of the early members included Vining Eilenfeld, Marlon Tank, and Herb Vanderblumen. Some of those names local Manitowoc County residents probably remember. But then Joe unexpectedly died at the end of 1965. And some of the planning efforts were temporarily suspended and delayed. But the following year, the county board did transfer the ownership of the courthouse square down in Manitowoc Rapids for a tourist wayside. And there were plans of developing the old public square for a possible pioneer village and museum site. As you remember, and for those local residents that go through Rapids every day, when you go north on North Rapids Road, the road actually cuts through the middle of the original public square that was laid out in 1836. And then in the 1930s, during the WPA project, the road that originally went around the square went actually through it. So today's road that goes through that property has cut right through the middle of the public square where the original courthouse and the original jail were originally located. Well, those plans kind of fell to the wayside, so to speak. This is before I-43 was built. So the Rapids Road actually used to be US Highway 141. That was the major thoroughfare from Green Bay down to Milwaukee. And everybody going north and south through this area would go through that area. So it was a good location for a potential museum site. But that didn't develop and that didn't really materialize. Then in 1967, plans by the Historical Society Planning Board considered several sites, particularly where the county fairgrounds were on New York and North 18th Avenue in the city of Manitowoc. The fairgrounds were there for many years before they moved out to the present expo grounds, and that land potentially would have been a site for a village. Now, if you think back what that might be like now, here we would have been right in the middle of the city of Manitowoc with the Pioneer Village. That didn't develop into any finalized plans, and interest did not wane, but in 1968, a poll was taken of the County Historical Society members to determine if they were still interested in building a historical village, and the vote was overwhelmingly in support of a program such as that. Interestingly, while the plans were being made for a pioneer village, the society actually didn't own any land in the county in which to build this pioneer village. Yet they started to collect historic buildings and other artifacts. And I think that's kind of an interesting sidebar to this whole story. Here you had a group of dedicated, interested people interested in doing a village, but they didn't really have any land in which to do it. Yet they proceeded to obtain and restore a Sioux Line locomotive and a tender car that was donated by Robert Miller of Milwaukee in 1967. And that was brought, interestingly, to Manitowoc. And I'll tell a little bit more about that story. But it's the only locomotive that came to a historical village by car ferry. So I'll tell you more about that in a minute. In November 13th of 1969, the board of directors met to consider the offer of land generously given by Hugo and Eleanor Vetting, who were willing to donate their 40-acre farm here in the town of Manitowoc Rapids for a pioneer village. And why did they do that? Well, Eleanor's homestead was going to be torn down, and she wanted that building moved here to the village, and that was really what kind of started this whole process. So in later that year, or later that month in 1969, there was a motion at one of the society meetings to accept the Vetting farm at the annual meeting, and this was unanimously approved. And that's really how the village came to be. If the Vettings hadn't really originally donated their 40 acres land, I don't know exactly how plans would have been proceeded along to have a pioneer in the county. But as it turned out, at the same time, the membership authorized the board to purchase the Niles Church, which was out on State Highway 151, for a cost of $300. And a warranty deed was written and an agreement signed to transfer the property to the Historical Society. And soon after that, a policy-making board of 5 members was named to be the village governing board. And this included Vining Eilenfeld, Harvey Stengel, Armin Keeter, Leslie Valesky, and Rule Klaczynski. And some of those names you probably recognize as well that are local names here in Manitowoc County. Then the society also voted to borrow $5,000 to begin moving buildings and beginning work on construction of the Sorenson home, the Niles Church, and the Collins Depot. And that's how things got started. Plans were drawn up. These kind of plans changed through time. Even as when I was director, we had other sort of development plans that were great on paper, never materialized. Other ones did take place and were followed. This is an early site plan that's in the files here from 1973. You can see railroad tracks, the railroad station, potential sawmill, grist mill down by the pond, plans for a wagon trail, grain storage, a stagecoach inn, a farm complex, and other street developments and locations of future buildings. So they were serious about organizing buildings along central cultural features like railroad tracks and streets and that sort of thing. and following the contour lines out here at the village. I should also mention Manitowoc County's village here is located in the scenic rolling kettle moraine area. It's not really totally flat. So there is a problem with siting buildings a little bit because you have to take into account the rolling landscape of the acres that we have here. And that posed some problems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I can show you some of the aerial views of the planning concern as well. Not so much where the buildings were going to come from, but where to site them to make it easy to walk through and adaptable as one progressed through the village property. So this is one of the early plans. Here's a picture of Hugo and Eleanor Vetting. And Eleanor had passed away in 1973 before the Sorenson house was completed in its restoration. Hugo was actually living here on the property when I came in 1987, and he lived in the house on the grounds where he and his family actually lived out here in the town of Manitowoc Rapids. But he was getting older in age, and he did have home care while he was here in his earlier or later stages of life. And in 1988, a year after I came, he passed away, and then we had a nice, the family had a nice service for him in the Niles church here on the grounds. And this is a picture of the Vetting house as it appears early on. It was built in 1956. Hugo actually built the house with his brother Walter, and the building is still used for storage. When I was here, we used to have board meetings inside. The living room, the kitchen was fully serviceable. We used it for, for programming and events, and as a staging area for changing clothes and that sort of thing. But it's still used today. And this is a picture of the Sorenson house. This is the first building moved here. This was Eleanor's childhood home. It was built in not in 1901, but it was purchased by her father in 1901. And the family lived there until 1944. The building was on land owned by Spancrete Concrete Company, and it was moved here in 1970. Moving costs we found in the files were $1,500 for a new foundation, about $500 for utilities, or the moving costs were $1,500. The foundation was about $500, and utilities was about $250. As we proceed through time, those costs escalated in amounts, and it cost a lot more to move more recent buildings here because of inflation and just the cost of living. The interior was renovated by the Sorenson family to depict a 1900 style kitchen and bedrooms and living room. So it's one of people's most favorite buildings here on the site. About the same time, a granary was available for moving to the village, and this was moved with sponsorship by the 20 Gardeners Garden Club of Manitowoc. And this building now sits behind the machine shed, and it will be eventually resited for a farm complex, which has always been in the original plans. But a granary, as you probably know, was used for storing corn and grain in bins. The bins are up on the second floor yet inside the building. And it also housed equipment such as corn shellers and fanning mills, corn and potato planters and other hand tools. It's in pretty good shape yet, so it wouldn't take too much to get it fully restored and sited. The Niles Church is probably one of the most iconic buildings here at Pinecrest Village. Everybody knows the village because of the schoolhouse and the church primarily, and the Sorenson house. But the building is interesting because it was actually moved in 3 different parts. The steeple came separate. There's a fellowship area or wing off to one side in the building, and then the main part of the sanctuary was put on dollies and wheels here from Highway 151. And the First Kiwanis Club of Manitowoc helped sponsor the move and the restoration of the building back in 1972 when it was moved here. The middle picture shows an early postcard view of the Gothic Revival Church on the left, and then you can see the old Shadyside schoolhouse in the background. And one of the things that they wanted to do immediately was to offer the church available for weddings. And the first wedding was held here in 1980, and the bell was donated after I started in 1987. And the First Kiwanis Club actually had a bell raising ceremony and ringing during one of their work nights here at the village. Another early building that was moved here was the Collins Depot. Collins is located in the western part of Manitowoc County. Passenger service there to the area ceased in the mid-1930s, and freight service ended about 1950. It was purchased early on in 1970, and it was moved in 1972 by ice structure movers who have moved many of the buildings here to Pinecrest Village. And it was moved here with sponsorship by the Clipper City Model Railroad Club. Sited next to the depot is the steam locomotive, tender car, a flat car, and a caboose. And this was quite the restoration job to get the locomotive here. And as I mentioned before, it was donated in 1967, but it was moved on the railroad car ferry, the SS Badger. It went from Milwaukee across Lake Michigan to Ludington, and then by the SS City of Midland car ferry back over to Manitowoc. So I'm sure we have the only locomotive that came to any historical village in the country by car ferry. So it's kind of fun to know that. Again, it was restored by the members of the Clipper City Model Railroad Club. And then Alice Chalmers in Milwaukee had donated a flat car. That was brought here, and then everything was moved here in 1975 and restored on site. Well, the locomotive wasn't restored here on site. That was taken to the roundhouse in Manitowoc and restored, mostly through the efforts of Larry Bond, who you see pictured in the lower right picture on the left. He was a great supporter of the village. Another early building that came here was the actually originally an old meat market building from Valders. It was built in 1900. It was used over at the Valders Limestone Company as an office building for many years. It was moved here in 1973. And then at about the same time, the Historical Society was given a large collection of materials in harness and shoe repair gear from the Wenzel and Edwin Sikora harness shop up at Tisch Mills, which is in the northeastern part of Manitowoc County. And his daughter, Joyce Sikora, donated all of the materials and equipment and tools to the village. And now it's our harness and shoe shop. It's also decorated for Christmas in this picture that we used. And you can see the calling card of Wenzel Sikora on the lower right. Here's a picture of the inside of the harness shop. It has a lot of the bridle gears and stitching machines and tools used to make leather equipment and tools and to repair shoes. It's pretty complete. It's a large collection. Another building that was made available early on was the Helle-Thompson log cabin. This is a Norwegian house. It was built about 1850 on a site over near Valders, which is a large Norwegian community of immigrants that settled there in the town of Liberty. The building was donated by the Propson family, and the logs were dismantled and hauled here by Hugo Vetting and L. Bartel in 1971. And the logs sat on the ground for 2 or 3 years, and it was rebuilt in 1974. By letting the logs sit on the ground for a number of years, many of them started to rot, and a lot of them couldn't be used. So the 2-story building, when they went to restore it, had to be diminished in size to what you see on the right as a 1.5-story log house. And they changed the orientation of the building a little bit. You can see on the left the door in the middle. And when you compare it to the picture on the right, you can see the where the door would have been under that upper window. Someday I hope the building is restored to its full size. Logs can be obtained, and efforts could be made to make it look like it did back when it was originally built. It would take a little bit of work and some funds to do it, but it's a very doable project. Helle-Thompson is pictured on the right slide photo, and he was a grandson of Thomas Olsen Helle, and the cabin was actually dedicated in 1974. That's a popular cabin among many of our visitors too. It's one of my favorites, actually. And here's some historic photographs of Thomas Helle and his wife, Carrie. And here's a picture of the cabin with one of the many, many school tours that have come out to Pinecrest Village over the years. May has traditionally been a very busy month, going back almost to the early start of the village, with many, many school groups from the public and parochial schools and homeschool groups that we have tour Pinecrest Village. Tours that we couldn't do this year, or Amy couldn't do. I don't have to do them anymore. And here's the Shadyside School. This is also out in the town of Manitowoc Rapids, not that far from the Niles Church. It's on the same highway. This was a one-room school that was built in 1872, and it was really named for the box elder trees that used to shade the schoolyard. And you can see the early photo of the building with some of the teachers and students on the right picture that's shown here. And the school was moved here in 1976 with support of the Rehrauer Foundation. And it also included moving 2 outhouses, which are fully restored and placed on site. You can see the field to the west of the village where these buildings have come in. We still use that entryway to move the buildings into the grounds. It's a little flatter, it's a little shorter distance. If you've been out to Pinecrest Village, you know it's a winding road that curves and comes downhill and then comes back up. And some of the big buildings can't make that big turn. So we were able to use that access from a field to the west that's privately owned through an agreement. So that's worked out very well for us over the years. Picture postcard that shows the church and the schoolhouse. I wanted to show it again here a little bit because you can see at one time there were electrical lines on poles that went throughout the whole village. There used to be a PA system that used to announce programs and times for events. One of the things I wanted to do when I first came was to bury all the electrical lines to make it look like a village in 1900 would have looked before electricity. And we did get a nice generous grant from the Wisconsin Public Service Corporation and their foundation to accomplish that. And when you walk through the grounds today, you really are stepping back in time, and it gives you a real sense of history 120 or so years ago. Another popular building out here that was moved, and actually not really moved, but well, part of it was moved, was the blacksmith shop, blacksmith and wagon shop. And this is a combination building that includes a granary on one part from a farm out at Francis Creek that was donated by Bob Lyman back in 1976. And the moving and renovation was sponsored by the J.J. Stinkle Company of Manitowoc. And it depicts the Anton Witt blacksmith shop at Four Corners on Menashan Avenue in Rapids Road, originally in the town of Manitowoc Rapids, now within the city of Manitowoc. The rest of the building was added onto to make it look like a blacksmith shop might have looked in the county back in 1900. And on the left, you can see Lloyd Witt at his forge in 1984. This was a postcard that was used by the village for many years. And I think I actually arranged to have that postcard made, now that I think about it. But Lloyd was a steadfast member, and his whole family was, and his brothers and sister, and were very instrumental in having programs come alive here at Pinecrest Village in its years, and to demonstrate the craft of and trade of blacksmithing at a fire and the handle. And it's really a complete, it's one of the best, I think, blacksmithing tool collections in probably the state, at least. It's a popular building among many people, and I know Amy does yet offer blacksmith programs where people can sign up and learn to do blacksmithing, which is a great thing to do. The third homestead site that came out to Pinecrest Village is the Joseph Kunze cabin. This was a Bohemian log house built around 1855 down in the town of Newton. It was donated by the Lipke family and moved here in 1976 and then restored in 1980 with support of the Junior Service League of Manitowoc County. And I think this is actually my favorite building at the village. I've always liked the Kunze cabin. I don't know why, but I just like the logs. I like the way the chinking fits between the logs. It's really tightly done. And it's a popular building to be used, especially at Christmas. I think a lot of people like going into the Kunze cabin at the Christmas time program to see and smell the fresh baked bread or cookies that are being made on the big cook stove in the building. But for some reason, that seems to be my favorite. And here's another picture postcard that shows that building early on. You can see, I don't know if that's Harold Borcourt's team of, I can't really read the writing on it. I can't remember now, but Harold Borcourt used to bring his Belgian team of horses, I think that's his tram, out to the village just about for every major program event that we would have here. And that was a popular thing for people to take a ride through the grounds on his tram pulled by his Belgians. June 26, 1977 was a big day at the village. The village had been in operation and development for about 7 years, and they decided to finally hold a dedication for Pinecrest, which was attended by hundreds and hundreds of people. If you look at the photo on the left, you can see in the background the Collins Depot, the locomotive, the tender, the harness shop, and then to the right of that, the blacksmith shop. And that's up on the ridge to the east. You can see a row of white pine trees that was planted behind the people standing there by in the crowd. And then where the band is playing is right on the grounds of the Kunze cabin. That all used to be an open vista now. Today, if you came out there, you couldn't see any of those buildings because those trees are huge. And they've really grown over the years. And then Armin Keeter is addressing the crowd. Armin was president of the Manitowoc County Historical Society at 2 different times. And he was also, he and Ione Keeter are major supporters of the village and always were willing to lend a helping hand no matter when needed. And then on the bottom picture shows the line of people coming to see the Sorenson house. And you can see the tall, towering white pines around and behind the building. And that's basically how the name Pinecrest Village came to be, because of the white pines. Another building that was moved here was the Law and Land Office. Although originally it was a barber shop in Manitowoc. It was donated in 1978 and moved here with support of the Nash and Duane families. And it was supported by the Manitowoc County Bar Association for many years. I think even when I was here, we painted the building twice. Most of the buildings are on, if you run any sort of outdoor museum, you know that you've got to get your buildings on some sort of maintenance schedule and make repairs when needed. But if you can get a building on a 7-year cycle for painting and roof repair and that sort of thing, that seems to be a good way to handle the maintenance, because these are old buildings. They're not aluminum sided. You know, it's an all original woodwork and siding in many cases that has to be scraped, primed, painted, and it's really a never-ending process that you have when you have these historic buildings to take care of. The next building that was moved out to Pinecrest was the Fritzie Karsten's house that was adapted and renovated and turned into a saloon on the first floor, and later on a doctor and dentist office on the upstairs. The lower left photo shows you what the home looked like about 1900. When they restored the building, they turned the building to the side gabled or non-gabled elevation for the main entrance, but you can see how the building would have been oriented originally. There's been some talk about redoing this building too, and maybe finding an original saloon or tavern in the county to move here, and then restoring this building back to its original purpose as a farmhouse, which could be the focus of the farmstead here at Pinecrest, because it has the machine shed right behind it, the granaries behind that, and then the cheese factory is right off to the side. So that it would make a nice focal point to do that, and it really wouldn't take a huge amount of effort to accomplish. But today it serves as their saloon, which is popular too. A summer kitchen was moved here in 1979, 2 years after the dedication date. The village really didn't have a welcome center where people could come in, and by that time they were charging admission and needed a place for people to come in to buy their tickets, to buy a book on local history or a craft item that was sold there at the gift shop. So they decided to take this summer kitchen that was offered to the Historical Society. It was originally built about 1866, and it was later turned into a summer kitchen, then a garage, and then a welcome center. And when I came, and all the time I was here, actually, that was our welcome center. But even that, we put on a 7-year cycle, and we had to paint it and paint the tin roof and restore the porch and put a brick walkway in front of it. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it's used now as we proceed through the presentation. But it was a very functional building for us and continues to be that way. Then a large garden nursery barn was made available, and the village didn't really have a maintenance area where people could work on projects, restore windows, store tools. So a large 20 by 50 foot barn was made available, originally built in 1919 by George Sieracki to house all his greenhouse and nursery equipment. In 1979, it was moved here, and then with sponsorship of Junius and Marie Ployce, Junius's Investment Corporation in Manitowoc. That was sited at the west end of the village, and it continues to be kind of a overall maintenance garage area for equipment and supplies that support the ongoing development and maintenance at the village. When I came, we actually had a fire truck too. It used to be parked inside the barn, and we later gave that back to the branch fire department. Also, we had a Miro dump truck when I came in 1987 that sometimes ran and sometimes didn't. So we ended up getting rid of that as well because we didn't really need a dump truck on the village side. We needed a smaller truck. The sawmill was brought here in 1979. The 70s were a busy time for a lot of buildings that came. And this was a sawmill that was used east of Michigan in the northeastern part of the county. And it was made fully operational in 1981. And it's sited originally right behind the train depot. And the Witts and Harold Verdant and others made this fully operational, and it was a very popular event at our Fall Harvest Festival, where we would saw up logs and demonstrate hay baling next to it and other farm events. And it just kind of fell into disrepair. It was a lot to take care of. The track was getting a little worn and dilapidated and off kilter. It was getting a little safe. There's no shields on it at all. Everybody kind of, well, at least I did as director, kind of cringed when they were using it because there were, like I said, there were no guards or anything in there. It was done the old-fashioned way. But new plans for a sawmill are underway, and I will talk about that in a little bit. But this is the old sawmill. Actually, that picture shows a outhouse behind it. I think that's still out there, just like that, in the tree line. Newton State Bank was another building that was brought out and moved here in the 1980s. This is 1982, so we've gone a decade now of development at the village. We're now in the 1980s. And this was moved and restored with support from the Manitowoc County Bankers Association. And this is another building that was painted at least twice when I was here, every 7 years or so. And but again, it's the popular building that's decorated nicely at Christmas with a nice warm fire inside. And it was also robbed at one time, not here at the village, but when it was down in Newton, which would make an interesting program too. Amy's thinking about doing something about that, which I think would be fun for the kids and adults. And the farm machine shed is not a historic building. This was built to store so many of the farm pieces of equipment and tools, hand tools, fanning mills, and other sorts of items. It was built in 3 years before I came in 1984. When I was here, we had so much more additional materials that were donated that we actually built an addition on the north side with viewing windows. And right now it's being used for storage, but when I was here, we used to use it as our entertainment center too. We would pull a lot of the equipment out there. We put in a dance floor for square dancing. This was kind of our food and beverage area as well. We had our picnic tables up there for German Fest in front, and a lot of the motor coach groups that used to come here used to come and use the machine shed for their catered meals from the Inn on Maritime Bay, and it was kind of a fun time. I know Gene Wolfmeyer dancers came out and danced on the floor every Fall Harvest Festival with music, and that always brought in a couple hundred people right there because of all the dancers and the families that would come. But it was always a fun time. In 85, a log smokehouse, the old Petzold smokehouse from the town of Schleswig was moved to Pinecrest and sited behind the law office. And Red Arrow Products of Manitowoc sponsored the moving and the costs. And we later, after we had to repair the front of the Kunze cabin, I thought it would be a good idea if we could put some of the log buildings closer together. So we actually did relocate it in 1995 and put it over by the Kunze cabin. And then you can see in the lower right picture, we had a crew come in and re-chink the sides and put a new roof on it. And we actually set it on a concrete slab to keep the moisture off the logs. And it's held up pretty well over the years, actually. Then in 1987, the Manitowoc County Historical Society decided to hire its first executive director, which happened to be me. And for the next 14 years, I helped bring in more buildings and start some new programs, and had a wonderful time doing actually all of it. And you can see we still have a volunteer picnic here. This is from 1991. You can see on the lower left. Fall Harvest Festival was always a good time. We had lots of people from all different walks of life come, including Alice in Dairyland in 1989. And we used to do our chamber after hours out at Pinecrest Village too. We did that several times over the years. Had a good time doing it too. It was fun. The first building that I moved when I came was the general store from Clark's Mills. This became available to us right after I came in '87. And the picture on the left is a tinted colored postcard showing the building back in 1909. And then the photo on the right side shows the building when it was the H.C. Morgan grocery store in about 1938. We were able to get the building for $1 from United Savings and Loan Association, and we moved it on March 15th, 1988. And you can see the lower picture on the right shows the building once it was restored. And then the inside picture was taken after I left because the building wasn't completely restored after I left in 2001. But I want you, on the upper right picture, I want you to look at the tin ceiling and the shelving units, because we were able to get those from the old Cato post office and general store out on Highway 10 in Cato. And the picture on the left shows you what that building looked like. It was built in 1868. And the inside picture shows you what the building looked like when we were able to get inside. And I first saw those shelving units, and you can see the tin ceiling that was still in place, the original tin ceiling. So I was able to write a grant and request permission to salvage as much of the materials, building materials and shelving units and whatever we could find in the building for reuse out here at Pinecrest Village. And the Wisconsin Department of Transportation also said yes. And we had a crew of volunteers that came out, stripped all of the ceiling tiles off, and then we were able to move that big, heavy shelving unit in one section onto a trailer out the front door and put on a trailer, and we wheeled it to Pinecrest Village, where we knew someday we would use it for restoration. So I'm so glad that we were able to salvage it, as much of this as possible for adaptive reuse. Otherwise, this whole thing would have been torn down. So I really think it turned out to be a great restoration project. Another building that became available was a bee house, and this was out in the town of Two Rivers in Shodo. And you can see what it looked like originally on the left. It was donated by Bill and Dorothy Wester family of Shodo. And we were able also to find from the family a picture of what it looked like in 1940 and 41. And what it had a little screened in porch, and it was still being used for the storage of bees and beehives out in Shodo. We moved the building here in 1998, and the Masters Builders Association of Manitowoc County is very generous and has restored the porch. The porch was in bad shape. We had to take that off before we moved it. And then many of our volunteers came to help repaint and restore the building inside. Here on the right, you can see Peg Harder. Peg was a long time volunteer here at Pinecrest Village and the Historical Society in general. And she and her husband Henry, spent as many hours at the village as I did, I think, over the years, probably more. One of the first things I wanted to do was to use the bee house as a changing exhibit gallery. We didn't have room at our office in Manitowoc for any exhibits, so I thought we could use the bee house as a changing exhibit gallery. And one of the first things I did was to apply for a Wisconsin Humanities Committee grant, which funded a Civil War exhibit. And then this was the second grant that I received, and it's called Bees and Honey, Beekeeping in Manitowoc County, which I thought was appropriate since it was a bee house. And Henrietta Mack from Reedsville and her son Stephen helped me arrange and obtain many of the items that were put on display in the bee house that you can see. And then we opened it in 1990. You know, when you take a historic building and you go to move it, you always wonder if it's going to fall off the dolly wheels or have problems. You know, of all the buildings that were here when I moved, when I was here, I mean, there was never a cracked wall, a window never broke, it never slipped off the dolly wheels. So, you know, I got to feel a lot better about moving these buildings through time because I didn't have to worry so much because the ice structure movers took such really good care of them. And, you know, when you transport them many, many miles by road, you'd think a lot of things could happen, but we really never had any incidents and nothing really happened. So I was kind of happy about that. And this is the first exhibit that we did in the bee house. And it featured a replica of the Civil War Company A flag. And that was dedicated in August of 1990. Then we were able to get a caboose from the Oshkosh Public Museum, which had it on their grounds for many years. And we were able to move that and bring it to the village in 1990. And this is a caboose that was used by the Wisconsin Central Railway. It weighs 16 tons. It was built in 1886. And we dedicated it in 1995. And before moving it here, we had to extend the railroad tracks to the north so that we could site the caboose on the tracks. And on the lower right, you can see Dick Walsky and Jack Preston, who used to work for the Chicago Northwestern, helping us lay track. Then in the 1990s, at the same time we were doing all these other projects, we were able to obtain additional property here at Pinecrest Village. And I put this slide together to show you the original 40 acres of land, which you can see in the middle on the lower part of the picture with the red dot marked 1970. And that's the original 40 acres of the Vetting farmstead. But then in 1991, we were able to obtain about 18 acres to the north, which links us to Highway JJ and the Manitowoc River is just beyond that. And part of our development plan was to have the entrance road extend up the hill to where the McAllister House and a new visitor center would be built, and have a new gravel parking lot adjacent to it. And this fulfilled that dream that we could finally expand and get all of the parking out of the village, have a central collection point where you could park, come in, pay your admission, walk out into the grounds, and enjoy the buildings and the landscape and the other programs and features that were here. Then we were also able to obtain an additional small acreage, just a little over an acre to the west behind the Thompson cabin, and this was donated by Arno and Lila Ployce. And then Wilbur Science actually was able to fund the complete purchase price for the 18 acres to the north. So within just a couple of years, the village grew almost half as big as it was from 1970. And it's nice to have buffer property around the village too, because there is development coming out from Manitowoc to the west, and a lot of new houses have been built out this way. But we're grateful for these donations that made this possible. Some of you may not realize that there's been a lot of commercials filmed out at Pinecrest Village. And in 1991, the Wisconsin Public Service filmed at the Saloon. They did a Western themed public service announcement for energy inefficient household appliances. And they set up, my gosh, they were here all day filming a 30-second promo, but they had people in Western attired clothing, and they used one of our wagons that rolled by the saloon. And it was kind of fun to be able to see that. And I know we've done other ones in the schoolhouse, and I know we used the Thompson cabin for another one. So there's been probably 4 or 5 or at least 6 different commercials that have been filmed out here over the years, which is kind of fun. A lot of people don't realize that. In the 90s, we were able to obtain and move the Two Creeks Town Hall. Two Creeks is the northeastern and the smallest township in the county, in the northeastern part along Lake Michigan. And these costs were paid with matching grants from the town of Two Creeks, and also by the Wisconsin Electric Power Company at Point Beach Nuclear Plant. One of the things that we learned quickly when moving these big buildings to keep the costs of moving them down was to take the roofs off and cut them down to 1 story, with the intention, of course, of rebuilding it. But to move a building, 17, 20 miles, just think how many wires cross the right of way from house to pole, and pole to another house, and pole to pole. Some of those costs would be $40,000 to $60,000 to $80,000 just for the utility costs to get the buildings here. So by taking the roofs off and being able to get underneath the electrical wiring, which they use by lifting up with a pole, it's amazing how much leeway there is in a power line like that. I mean, you think it's straight across. Now there you can raise it like 5, 6, 10 feet, as you can see here. And that's how Ice Movers was able to move the Two Creeks Town Hall here. And I'll show you another example in a minute. We had a crew from Mike Check Builders install new cedar shingle roof on the building. And then our volunteers, as always, industriously and laboriously and faithfully came to help scrape, prime, and paint the building. And here you can see Leslie Gakey up on the ladder, and Henry Harder and Don Novi at the tractor with a load of supplies. And that we had a school group here the day that the Two Creeks Town Hall was set on the foundation. And you could see all the kids having their sack lunch, watching the building come up across the field and then sited on the building foundation. And then on the right, you could see what the building looked like when it was fully restored. Another challenge was moving the dressmaker shop down on Franklin Street in Manitowoc out to the village in 1994. Again, there were so many utility lines there that we took the false front off. We took the roof off as well, and then we were able to scoot right underneath all the power lines and come right out to the village. And we opened the building in 1998 during a special Women's Day program. And then on the lower right, you can see we formed a committee, and Virginia Temme, Rogine Moore, and Peg Harder were on that committee, along with some other of our Manitowoc County Historical Society volunteers. We're lucky that we have lots of volunteers that like to paint, because there's always a lot of painting out here. In 1994, we were given the opportunity of moving a stone smokehouse out to Pinecrest, and this was donated by Roger and Jean Imhoff. It was located in the River Heights subdivision on the west side of town. But this was a very labor-intensive proposition that I know I ended up working on Mother's Day one year to help take this down because we had to get it off the property. I think I worked Father's Day too, but we had to take the building down stone by stone. And then I initially labeled every stone so that we could put it back in place. But when it came back to putting it back together, we didn't really follow that, but it came pretty close. But we saved every stone, including the rafters. In 1995, Pinecrest celebrated its 25th anniversary, and we had a special program out here. The board of directors planted a tree in front of the Sorenson house, and we had a nice anniversary cake that was served to visitors that came out. We opened a nature trail, which led down to some millstones and some other features along the pond, which is located, you can't see it, it's behind the trees, but you get a feel for the rolling landscape of the grounds. And then we were able to the Rockwood Firehouse. This came in December of 1995, and the Manitowoc County Firefighters Association was able to fund the move of it. This was donated by the Agnes Miller family of Rockwood, and this is in the town of Kossuth. One of the things that we had to do to move this building was take the bricks off. A lot of them were not in good shape, and it was a little too heavy to move as well. A lot of them would have fallen off, so we had to, we took all the bricks off and then cleaned them and put many of them back on. And we put a new cedar shingle roof on the building, and this was low enough that it did fit underneath all of the electrical wires. And then here's a nice picture of it when it was restored on the left or on the right side with new doors. And we had a special Firemen at Work program in 1923 during the opening of it in October of 1998. When we sited the town hall, the firehouse, the dressmaker shop, and the store, we actually formed a new street behind the church. The first time I came to Pinecrest Village was in 1984. I attended my sister-in-law's wedding, and we used to park, well, there was a big gravel parking lot up behind the church where these buildings are. And we needed to expand, the grounds and layout to accept all these different buildings. So the idea was to make a narrow road, have tree-lined plantings along it, which have now grown to huge maple trees. But we also needed to connect all of the buildings so it wouldn't be so muddy for people to walk. So our volunteers built a boardwalk that connects these 4 buildings on the south end of the village grounds. And over time, they needed, a little bit of work has been needed to restore some of the planks and whatever, but for just accessibility and for walking the grounds, especially during rain or snow, it really was a good idea to do that. Then in 1998, we were given the opportunity to obtain the Hiram McAllister farmhouse. And this is a nice historic view of what that building looks like. It's one of my favorite pictures, I think, of all the pictures we have of all the buildings in the collection. It was donated by Richard and Don Haupt and Evelyn Haupt Karstens families. And it's a large 2-story Greek Revival farmhouse. Hiram McAllister was the first recorded farmer in Manitowoc County, and he grew the first crop of grain, wheat, that was taken by Wagon up to Green Bay, because at that time in the 1850s, Manitowoc did not have a grist mill yet. So there's a lot of history related to the house that we were able to preserve by moving it here. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. Then we were offered a cheese factory in 1997, and we moved it that year. And then it took us about 4 years to get it restored. And here you can see the historic cheese factory in its original location in the town of Schleswig. This is where Tina Luloff made cheese until about 1893, and it was donated by Daisy Hornick, who lived in the old farmhouse nearby and adjacent to it. And on the right, you can see the restored picture of what the building turned out to be, with the intake, the milk intake in the front, and a wagon bringing the milk to the cheese factory. Then we were given the opportunity to bring a section of the old Collins Bridge over the Manitowoc River from the town of Rockland out to the village here. And this was a 65-foot section of what's called a 5-span pony truss steel bridge, built originally in 1911. We moved here in May of 24 of 2001. And the idea was to use it as part of the road system here on the grounds. With development plans, it was soon realized that there was really never a stream or a course of water that the bridge would span. So now the plan potentially would be to make it available for another entity where they could use it as a trail, pedestrian bridge, or in a park or something like that. So even though we saved it, we may not be able to use it here, but at least someone else will be able to adaptively reuse it in an appropriate setting. Over the years, there's been special programs and events, and I just wanted to show you a couple of the ones that are fond in my memory. I always loved our Fall Harvest Festival. It was always a nice time to showcase craft events, spinning, rope making, sauerkraut making, lots of the home crafts. And that was always a fun time. The Gene Wolfmeyer dancers always used to come out for that program. You know, the weather was always perfect. It was always just a nice summer day or fall day here at Pinecrest. And then, as I mentioned before, we used to do a lot of chamber after hours events here, where we would invite business members and other nonprofit groups out to Pinecrest Village for an after-hour dinner, and that was always a nice event. And then some of you probably don't remember or didn't realize that we had a circus out here one year in 1996. The Hendricks Brothers Circus came to Pinecrest, including an elephant. and set up in the field behind the church. And we had 2 shows out here. And I remember coming out, I had to be on site, and I had to set up a tent, my own sleeping tent, so that I could be like the site manager while everybody was here. Because this was one of those traveling circuses that came by truck and car and semi-trailers. And we had quite the number of cars here in the village. And then we did hold an ox team event here at a day in 1850. And this gentleman and his team used to come all the way up from Marina, Wisconsin. And those are big animals. And but a lot of people used to come out and take a look at them. And you could have wagon rides through the village pulled with a team of oxen. I don't know if oxen have been back to the village since that time. I don't think so. And then in the 90s, we used to do concerts on the village green. And this was the Lakeshore Wind Ensemble group conducted by Michael Arndt. And they used to come out and do concerts. And we did this for probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. But it was always a fun time. I got to narrate it one year. Parking in the village. I wanted to show you what the village used to look like before we acquired that additional property. We used to have to park all the cars in the village, which meant that you couldn't see half of the buildings half the time. And it got to be kind of a safety issue too. But here you can see the Fall Harvest Festival in 1989 with, we had 800 people here. And then we had another parking lot down by the Welcome Center that we used during the week. And that would always be full on program event days. And then we'd sometimes have groups come in and help direct traffic too. And you can see in the lower right, even in 1977, they were having Boy Scouts come help direct traffic. But now with the new setup here with the parking lot and visitor center set up here in the McAllister House, it's worked a lot better. In 1990, the Historical Society was given the Reuben Goldthwaite's Trophy for outstanding leadership in local history across the state. And we were able to go down to Madison that year and accept the award. And you can see Dale Brasser, who was our treasurer at the Historical Society at the time, and Don Steckmesser, president, myself, and George Miller, who was president of the Board of Curators. This is taken in the State Historical Society's library. Then, after I left in 2001, a lot of new buildings were brought out, new exhibits, new programs, new leadership, and more progress. And here's a nice aerial view of the grounds, which you can see the caboose in the lower middle, the road going over towards the blacksmith shop, around towards the school and church, and back down towards the bee house. And that what's shaded in yellow is the flower garden, or the wildflower garden that they have here now. And I just want to run through a few things that show what's happened in the last 19 years or so. One of the first buildings that came out to the village after I left was the Knitting Dance Pavilion. This was down in the village in Cleveland. Armin Keeter and I actually went and looked at this building back in the 90s, thinking it would make a great addition for the village, where we could set up food service, have dancing inside, and use it for special programming and events. And that idea actually developed into this move, and was opened during a traditional barn dance in 2005. So this building's been out here 15 years. Then one of the other things I always wanted to do is to reorganize the side room at the blacksmith shop. And this happened in 2008. And what they did was they cleared out the materials that were in there and reorganized it, moved some to other buildings, and then made this a carpentry and woodworking shop. And now they can use it for interactive exhibits and workshops and special demonstrations and for tours. Looks great. And then here's a prairie restoration area and a nature trail. It reduced the amount of grass that needed to be cut and also developed into a really beautiful wildflower field. And here's the McMaster Farmhouse, which was opened on May 1st of 2013. And it houses the research center and gift shop and offices for the staff. Then the other project that took place was they took the old Welcome Center and made that into a hands-on print shop. And that turned out to be a nice development too. And the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum offered some help, as did others. And this was funded with a grant from the Gannett Foundation. That turned out to be a nice project as well. A lot of new programs. In 2015, the Historical Society was awarded Curator's Public Program Award for their Buffalo Bill Wild West Show, which is a really popular event. And this takes place in the big field behind the church. The Sieracki Bee House Gallery was converted to the doctor and dentist office in 2017. And a new sawmill is being installed on the south end of the property with support from the Mid-Lakes Rustic Iron Tractor Club. And that's scheduled to open this summer. In the background, you can see the big white two-story building. That's the Mimi Pole House, or not Mimi Pole House, but the Mimi House. And I'll show you the slide of a close-up slide of that. Major new project here at Pinecrest Building. He's been hitting this up for the last several years. This is an old stagecoach built in 1847 on the old military road from Greeley to Milwaukee. And it's in the southern part of Manitowoc County in the town of Mimi. It became available, actually Armin Key went down to look at this building too, back in the 90s as a potential welcome center. And long story short, the building was purchased in 2013. It was moved here in 3 sections finally, with the first floor being moved here in 2017. And adjacent to it is the Mimi Pole House that was moved here in 2018, and the livery stable. And that was dismantled and reassembled here. And here's a nice view of the 4 buildings, including a chicken coop. Up on second floor of the Mimi house is a really unique stage area with some interesting scenery, hand-painted scenery that will be all reinstalled when the building is completely renovated. And then also nearby the Welcome Center here at the McAllister House is a historic windmill. And that's been refurbished and installed just last year. And it makes a nice focal feature for the entrance to the village. And it's also part of the new logo for the Historical Society. And then the Coomer Smoke moved stone by stone back when, was finally reassembled 5 years later with help from the Coomer family. And then it was opened on 25th, 2019 last year. And you can see the Coomer family standing outside the building. That's a nice addition too. And then last summer, the Historical Society was again a Reuben Goldthwaite's trophy. And I was invited to come in words. And I believe it was the hottest day of the summer then. It was in the 90s, at least. It was a warm day, but out, including director of the Wisconsin Historical Society. You know, the village, when you think back over the years, it have been made possible without volunteers, whether they're playing accordions in the saloon, you know, dressing up and singing, you know, baling hay, laying sidewalks, coming out for events, giving special programs in the church. It's all of that collectively that makes the society what it is. And it was always a truly a great opportunity for me to be part of all that. Now, if you want to read more about the village and the buildings, there are two little booklets that are available. Back in 1995, we published a book called Sharing the Past. Some of the local libraries still have copies of that available. But a more up-to-date story is called Creating Our Story that Amy put together in 2016. And that's available for sale here at the Welcome Center. And I think some of the libraries have that as well. So if you're interested in reading more about that, check into that. And also back in 1982, on the anniversary of the Historical Society, they published an article on the first several years of the Historical Society by year and all the different things that happened from time to time. Any organization that has a long-standing should record its history so that people know what happened and took place over the years. And then you can see Emil Bench picture here. He was the first president of the Historical Society in 1906 and served until 1914. And thank you for your support, and because of your membership, financial support, and your interest, the future, I think, for the Pinecrest Historical Village for the next 50 years, foreseeable future looks extremely bright. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon.